Just to kind of review where to find stuff on the course website, just in case you've, missed a class or two, something like that. This is how our course website looks, and generally I'm trying to surface things in a useful order. So take a look at the reading. You don't have to pour through and memorize everything on every page. It's fairly crunchy and technical, but it's a great survey of the kind of stuff that we're talking about. And for those of you who are a little bit more kind of ecosystem, process, flow, spatially minded, or mathematically minded, the Hammett and Cole book basically just pulls together a whole bunch of studies and says, this is what we found about water resources in terms of physical water quality aspects, biological contamination aspects, recreation, aesthetic, degradation aspects, and stuff like that. So it just kind of collects a bunch of the research that is underpinning what we talk about in this class that we don't really have time to get into when we are together in class. So there's that, and then of course the PowerPoints, the advertise the resource, impacts of that resource, moderating factors, resistance and resilience for this particular class of resource, and then what to do about managing those. And then just kind of a brief reminder of, okay, for the park that you've selected for this semester, take a think, spend an hour on each one of these classes of resources outside of class, just kind of Googling around for, okay, what is the soil type or types typical of my park? Do I have soils that are interfacing with water systems? Or am I in a semi-arid or arid environment or ecosystem set with not really much of any surface water flowing or standing, for example? So we want to kind of get a sense, before we get too far from each of these classes of resource, what's kind of showing up or around the parcel of your national park. Okay, cool. So I've got you a link for the Web Soil Survey, for example, which will give you some fairly detailed information, more detail than we need, but it's on a web map enabled system, so you don't have to go digging through a bunch of databases. You just kind of pan and zoom to the area that you need and click through to the soil types, soil depths, soil series, that sort of thing. It's all just kind of right there. All right, and then in class, we did a Fulgurite soil resource management exercise, and most everybody sort of handed that in at the end of class, so that is good to go for most of you, and you can turn that in if you were not in class the other day if you need to. So here we go. Our next move is to head over to our water resources, and let's kind of take a quick tour through those. So I'm going to kind of parallel the online class resources with that, but again with some more specific examples instead of just sort of the basic walkthrough that the PowerPoint can do a plenty good enough job of introducing. Okay, so we've got water resources, and this is going to be the water resources in the groundwater fraction, in surface waters fraction, flowing or still calm water, flat water, as it's called in different places. This is also going to be the atmospheric water, and to some extent, water is going to be one of our key ingredients, of course, in weather patterns for your area. So we're going to consider, in our climate section, issues of weather, short-term local things, and climate, longer-term, larger spatial scale things like temperature, wind, rainfall, etc., snowfall. We just want to kind of think ahead to that and have an open tag for atmospheric fraction or compartment of moisture and water cycling for today. Okay, so water as a resource, we've got a couple different aspects to think about. When you're thinking about, let's say, an alpine pond, so this is a small body of water that is above tree line. It is a very, very, very fragile kind of ecosystem. Alpine ponds also extremely beautiful, and the streams feeding those and draining those, in some cases, not all alpine ponds have an outlet stream. Those are very, very, very high quality and highly sought after as a recreation resource. Yeah, so the flowing and the still water, very, very cool stuff. Water is going to be a major driver of the hydrophony, that is the acoustic resource, the soundscape of where your recreationists are going to be experiencing your park. The sound of tumbling water or whitewater hydraulics, individual features like a rapid are called hydraulics. Without that water, that soundscape doesn't exist. Without that water, and in the particular case of flowing waters, specifically waterfalls, we don't have the human health and wellness benefit or value of these recreation areas, like your national park, in terms of so-called negative atmospheric ionization. As it turns out, we receive health benefits by standing, breathing, and existing near waterfalls. There's a whole bunch of research on it going back several decades, and it's actually a fairly strong effect. So when we're kind of making a case for working our asses off managing water resources, we got to understand it's all of everything. It's not just the pond that we can see or the big lake or the seashore interface that we are managing. It's health benefits, it's acoustic benefits, it's obviously all the wildlife benefits and habitat benefits and so forth. Like, water is kind of everything and everywhere, and it touches every other aspect of what we're dealing with. We've been talking about caves, karst ecosystems, which are 100% created by water, with mechanical erosion and especially chemical weathering, dissolution of limestone matrix material. Okay? So when we're talking about the quality of this resource, we're talking about some specific physical, biological, and human social or subjective evaluative characteristics. For physical characteristics of the water, we need to make sure that we are paying attention to stuff like the cloudiness of the water. Is anybody familiar with the term turbidity? Okay. So highly turbid water is chalky. It doesn't allow a lot of light to penetrate to the bottom. And water can be turbid naturally, as in the case of a lot of recreationally extremely popular places like Glacier National Park. You may have heard of it or been there. Where glacial milk or glacial melt outwash is basically bringing a lot of rock dust. So pulverized stones, pulverized soil, coarse fragments, stuff like that getting ground by a glacier as it advances. And then the glacier melts at its outward, typically lowest elevation edge, and flushes a whole bunch of that dust down through the stream. So turbidity, not automatically a problem. Where it is a problem is where humans are causing it. So the other day when we were in the soil section and looking at people on souped up four-wheelers doing rooster tails through some water areas, this was kind of an issue. All right, we saw this clip here. To the extent that that water is not naturally getting stirred up quite a bit and it's not fast flowing, right? That's a bottomland slow flowing system. We might just call this like a mud hole, which is an extremely slow flowing system. That turbidity is absolutely destroying those lightweight soil particles, in particular the clay particles that can take days or weeks to settle out of the water column. It's a colloidal suspension that can take a long time to settle out or flocculate out of the water column. That's a whole lot of habitat wrecked for a whole lot of fish and benthic macroinvertebrates that are the fish's food, and so on and so forth. So here in the Midwest, where we have a whole bunch of trout fishing going on, like where we're headed for a field trip in a month here, if we have people, as they do sometimes, taking their four-wheel drive pickup truck and driving it through Ozark Scenic Riverways to see if they can like get their high clearance vehicle through the riverbed, because that would be cool if we could do that. Well, that's a fun thing, but everybody downstream suffers for that recreation impact. So we pay a lot of attention to physical water quality. What is the turbidity contamination that is specifically deriving from humans? If it's a naturally turbid system, the wildlife there's going to be adapted for that. Yeah.
I just want to back up what you said about like clay settling so long.
Yeah.
When I was planting my garden this spring, I tested my soil with the jar method where
Yeah.
you shake it all up and it settles in its layers, and it took like 2 or 3 days for that clay to finally settle down.
Yeah, that's a real thing.
You could see through it. Like,
yeah.
it was crazy.
So what's happening here with that process of settling out or flocculation is you have coarse fragments, stones, pebbles, that are going to drop immediately out of the water column, right? You have sand particles, which are basically going to do the same thing. Silt particles take on the order of up to a couple of hours to settle out as we get smaller and smaller, sub-millimeter diameter of these particles. Where a clay particle is 100th or 1,000th or 10,000th, or it's only a few microns, a few millionths of a meter in diameter, you're getting down to a size now where Brownian motion, random molecular motion of individual water molecules in the water column hitting each one of those clay particles and knocking it around like a very lightweight ping pong ball, well, half of that impact, half of that motion on average is going to be up. Now the other half is going to be down. But if there's any kind of thermal convection, stirring, currents, stirring that water column, you can keep that clay particle in suspension. It's not dissolved, it's not in solution, it's not Kool-Aid, it's more like a paint particle in the paint solvent. Okay? It can keep that in solution for days, or again, up to weeks in a more stirred up regime. Okay? So, this is a big deal. We got to know what soil type we have. Does it have a high clay fraction, and is it going to take forever and ever and ever to clear back up after somebody stirs it up by riding their horse through a clay pan area, or taking their ATV through a muddy, clayey, sticky soil kind of an area? Okay? Very, very tricky stuff. It's just hard to manage turbidity because this is one of those quick impacts, slow recoveries. So the dose response, for those of you familiar with medicine, the dose response, the dose is quick. It might be 5 seconds of somebody driving an ATV through, and then literally several days or a week or more for that system to fully reset back to its pre-impact state. Okay, so one of our big overarching rules for this semester is you can give as the manager, but you can't take away. Another one of our overarching rules is impacts happen fast and heal slowly. Sound good? All right, let's move on. So, beyond physical turbidity measurement, we also want to keep in mind for your particular park this semester, what's the chemical pollution loading? Like, how contaminated is our broad ecosystem? Is there a whole bunch of coal fly ash? Hopefully not anymore these days with like the Clean Air Act from decades and decades ago, almost 50 years ago. Is that stuff getting blown in? Do we have a whole bunch of diesel smoke and particles coming in off of the interstate that chops our national park in half? That's a problem at some places. We talked about at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where air quality is a real health concern and danger there. A lot of those diesel carcinogenic type particles, they're getting washed somewhere. They're getting filtered out by tree leaves. Trees are awesome at filtering out air quality. We'll get into air quality stuff in that unit later on. But once it's filtered that stuff out, it's typically the raindrops hitting those leaves that are knocking those diesel particles, soot, ash, whatever it is. Dry plastic particles are now a thing on every square meter of the surface of our planet now. All that stuff is washed somewhere, typically by rain action, and it's going to collect in our flowing waters. It may get sequestered in soil sediment and buried and become part of the geologic record as the plastic age or the chicken bone age, as some researchers have suggested the Anthropocene might be characterized by. But the thing is, those plastic particles, soot particles, diesel particles, whatever, that's all going somewhere, and it tends to collect and be moved around by our water resources. So what's the chemical contamination in addition to the turbidity loading in our water systems, the water resources cycling through our national park? Do we have a whole bunch of people who've driven vehicles into our lake, like at Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge, where we have a whole bunch of engine oil, crankcase fluid, and so forth in the water because we have highways going across that and the rain washes that downhill into the system. So we're dealing with that. If you are a person who can get pregnant and you happen to get pregnant, you should not be eating a lot of fish out of Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge because of the heavy metal contaminations in that water from both historic coal plant discharge into the air and then particulate like mercury accumulation into that water, but also things like the General Dynamics ammunition factories that were there following World War II. Manufacturing is a dirty thing. In the United States, we mostly outsource that to other people, so it's their problem. We just ship the manufactured products in. But we still have that legacy of that water contamination leading to things like, hey, humans who can get pregnant maybe don't have a ton of crab orchard fish. Or if you do, talk to your doctor first. Mercury is a hell of a drug. All right. So we have chemical issues and physical water property issues. Things like temperature of the water. As the water is colder, it can dissolve more gases like oxygen. This is why the big ocean fisheries for things like tuna and so on and so forth, they tend to be at the high northern latitudes, like, Deadliest Catch? What was that TV show where they're crab fishermen? Alaska. Yeah. So it tends to be very high latitude in the northern hemisphere and high latitude in the southern hemisphere as well, because that water's really cold. Cold fluids can hold a lot more dissolved gases like oxygen that big fish need a lot of to thrive. Okay? So where we have nutrient upwelling and cold water in combination, that's where we get big fisheries that serve and feed billions of human beings. The same thing is true at your park, but on a much smaller scale. Hot, deoxygenated water is lethal to fish. This is part of why when you see, the glossy photos or the beautifully oversaturated, short video clips of like, a Caribbean cruise or something like that, that water is crystal clear because everything's having a hard time growing in it, right? It's just a lot easier for things to exist in very cold water. So to the extent that water is naturally turbid, that turbidity, those particles tend to act like shade and cool off that water. So that could help certain species. But if we're adding turbidity unnaturally into a system that's not adapted for turbid waters, then the primary producers that are sort of driving the food web for that turbid water, they can't get sunlight except at the very surface. So shallow freshwater invasive species like duckweed don't care. Everything else, the natural freshwater plants living in that water column, really care, and they start dying out right away. And that lowers that oxygenation of the water again because the plants aren't releasing oxygen into the water because they're dead. Dying materials release carbon dioxide into the water. All right, so as they decompose. So we have chemical and physical considerations of the water. Do we have a bunch of crankcase fluid when somebody, this is a thing that's happened many, many, many times. Somebody is either drunk or disoriented or is having trouble perceiving their environment. Maybe it's very foggy and at night, or in some places like in the northern Midwest and in northern New England, like Maine, New Hampshire. People might be pre-hypothermic after a long, difficult hike. They get in their vehicle and they're not fully cognitively functional. Pre-hypothermia, one of the symptoms is sort of mental fog or disclarity, or malcognition, and they'll drive off the boat ramp. Or if it's foggy and they miss a, boats only sign, because the boat ramp is 80 feet wide, right? They just follow the parking lot down and they drive into the water. That is, a real safety and survival risk for the human, but it's also a major, major chemical contamination risk. There are hundreds of chemical additives in gasoline alone. Not to say anything for the, crankcase, radiator fluid, all of that stuff, blinker fluid, and so forth. So, we as humans, we put a lot of chemicals into the water. At Winyah Bay ecosystem, at Cumberland Island National Seashore, for example, the Park Service had to ban, just physically shut out, all two-stroke internal combustion boats. Because two-stroke engines, they burn oil with the gasoline. They are dirty. They're not well-sealed engines. They leak a bunch of stuff. They put a ton of chemical contamination out in the exhaust because it's poorly combusted gasoline and oil products. And that stuff gets discharged into the water. Often that exhaust is bubbled through the water on cheaper engines or cheaper outboard boat motors, so that you're not seeing this plume of like blue-white smoke because your engine's poorly tuned or whatever. It's a way for the manufacturer to kind of hide those emissions visually, but that makes it all the more worse for any sensitive freshwater and marine species that are trying to breathe through and swim through that water, which got a bunch of engine exhaust bubbled through it. And sometimes limitation of the use is going to be the thing. Okay, so water resources, they are not just the water itself. It is also some things like this anti-dune formation at Medano Creek, or Medano Creek, depending on your accent. Each one of those little dunes is, if you watch very, very, very closely on the riffles, dunes normally migrate, or riffle beds migrate downstream as the water sort of pushes the particles downstream. Medano Creek is almost unique in the world, where if you watch these and track them at fixed locations and points, they're actually migrating upstream. They're called anti-dunes because the particle size is perfectly sorted. The slope is at a perfect level in sand, and the flow rate is exactly what is necessary for the front side of each of these anti-dunes to get undermined instead of the back side. This is super rare, and the Park Service, in recognition of this, by the park hydrologists who figured this out, they now protect this specifically as a unique or characteristic or outstanding resource or recreation value, an ORV, of Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve. This is a weird quirk of hydrodynamics. It's just super weird and rare. And so this is a great opportunity to educate folks about forest hydrology and watershed management at Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, and that's exactly what the National Park Service does. Science and education, two of their five major sort of overarching reasons for existence, okay? So, the interaction of soil type and flow regime here, super, super interesting and unusual. and this flow rate with this basically glacial outwash, or snow melt at least, from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains here in the background, means this water is super duper cold. And that is a part of the experience. People think desert, hot, when they see dunes. We've all seen the movie Spaceballs, right? The old Mel Brooks film where they're combing the desert. And it's hot, and it's gross. Here, it gets really, really cold. It is not at all uncommon for a typical late spring or early fall day at Great Sand Dunes here at Medano Creek to drop below freezing at night and get a little bit of frost growing up out of the ground, hoarfrost as it's called, and so forth. So below freezing at like 4 in the morning, and then hit 130, 140 degrees out on the dunes like 6-8 hours later, right? That's a huge temperature swing. That is crazy. And it is real, and it's fairly common. So people have the experience, this fun surprise of like whipping off their socks and shoes on this like blisteringly hot sand, and then jumping into the water, and then like jumping right back out because it is ice cold. Okay? So the physical characteristics, things as basic as temperature and flow rate, cubic feet per second, or discharge, or flux as it's called, the oxygenation of the water. These things are things that we have to protect. Not just for the fact that these are habitat for wildlife, but for the fact of the water resource needs protection as well on its own merit. Okay? Cool. So, this is Beavers Bend in Oklahoma, and that is a spot where the terrain and topography, in particular, the elevation change, and the flow rate combine to provide a very specific kind of resource. These cascades, as they're called, a sequence of waterfalls, and provides not a unique in the world, but an exceptional example of a recreation opportunity, right? So think about all of the different kinds of recreation that are characteristic of visitors at your chosen individual national park this semester. Is whitewater kayaking, rafting, playboating, stuff like that, is that a thing at your park? It is at a few, but not all parks have this. Not even many parks have something like this, okay? So what this means is, for specific resource-dependent kinds of recreation, like whitewater rafting, you have to protect that opportunity to go whitewater rafting. Okay? Like, without that combination of terrain and geology, topography, and forest land cover management, right? Moderating things like overland flow and discharge into a stream to generate this kind of flow instead of clear cutting, we don't have whitewater rafting. Or we have something even worse. We have catastrophic, dangerous, like Cat 5 plus rapids that are lethal to most non-expert whitewater rafters, and then nothing the rest of the year, right? All the discharge all at once, and then nothing for everybody all the rest of the time. So, managing water resources, not easy as a forester. That's okay. Okay, so let's consider water as an experience resource, as well as a physical and biological resource or resource support, respectively. Just take a look at that video here as it loops back and forth. Can you see how this drive would be as the youth say, cool AF, the drive becomes part of the experience because of the water resource and the topography, right? You can't have this kind of a waterfall without seasonal variation in precip and a very steep slope and a very particular kind of upper watershed up above this, okay? So the Park Service, or whatever agency manages this particular spot, they have a choice. They can run the roads far from here, which is probably a lot cheaper in the long run. Can you imagine how often they have to repair this little stretch of road? And how much more burly this road construction right here has to be in order to withstand this kind of stuff? A little bit of water moving fast has an absolute metric hecton of kinetic energy behind it. You guys ever seen any of the old like 1980s, 1990s era YouTube videos of people partying and kind of low-key rioting in downtown Carbondale, like in the good old days / bad old days?
Halloween riots.
Yeah, exactly. People flipping vehicles, lighting couches on fire, stuff like that. Like, SIU is one of the places, one of the top 10 in the country, as it turns out, reasons why colleges in the 80s and 90s got that reputation as some places that are just like party schools. And you go here to just kind of blow 4 years and then, go get a job doing whatever. Trying to remember anything that you sort of blacked out in class on. Okay? The reason that riots are controlled in some countries using water cannons, which are basically fire engine pump trucks with not long hoses, but just basically a right angle, and you just aim it at people, and you see people getting yeeted backwards, I don't know, whatever the past progressive form of the yeet is. But anyway, the reason that riot cannons just use water is because it's cheap, plentiful, and you physically cannot, as a human being, stand against water moving that fast. So with the recent flooding last couple of days in Pennsylvania, where you see people taking nighttime cell phone videos of flood water rushing down their street, water that is ankle high, about 4 or 5 inches deep and fast flowing, like more than 5 miles an hour, is enough to sweep you off your feet and carry you to your death down a street by tumbling you and holding your face underwater and injuring you and eventually knocking you out and you drown. It doesn't take much water. 5 inches isn't that much, okay? But the kinetic energy of water, because water is extremely dense, thanks to its bent molecular geometry and weak hydrogen bonds holding that solution tighter together, for those of you who are chemistry nerds, it moves mountains, right? The advisor, my research advisor, a guy named Bob Manning at the University of Vermont, he's since retired, but he was on a research project in the Grand Canyon. And one day they were crossing one of the side canyons from one side of the side canyon to the other, walking along the Colorado River. When the rangers escorting this research group got a call on their radios saying, hey, we've got reports of flash flooding in Bright Angel Canyon, whatever side canyon they were trying to cross, and you guys need to get out of there if you're new there. And they were in the middle of crossing that area. And in the course of about 90 seconds, the water went from a trickle that wasn't getting their feet wet in sandals to rolling Geometro or Festivas, for those of you who remember those Ford Pintos, small car-sized boulders just cartwheeling down the canyon like it's no big deal. That's the kinetic energy effect, or the capability of flowing water. Okay? So, all that to say, when you decide as the ranger to put a road through an area like this because you're trying to provide high-quality access to experiences and opportunities to experience a waterfall like that up close safely, you're signing yourself up for a hell of a lot of road maintenance and the occasional search and rescue. You guys all see the little pull-off area right next to the waterfall. They had to cut that or dynamite that pull-off area off the side of this road because people are going to stop here. And some people are going to stop and climb over the guardrail and get a little bit closer and just dip a toe in. And some of those people are going to get slip and fall action into the water and get tumble wetted all the way down until we might find a shoe or something, maybe. Okay, yeah.
Do you know where this is?
I don't actually.
Just trying to find it. I couldn't either.
Grabbed this off of Reddit at one point a couple of years ago, and it didn't have any more metadata attached to it. So there you go. So, water as a resource. We're taking into account characteristics of landform and stuff like that because we can't extricate the two. Water is heavy, so we can't treat it like a fungible resource to just like move around and like build a pond over here and let this pond over here get impacted and kind of mitigate in that way. It's not an apples to apples shift like that. Water is 1 metric ton per cubic meter. That's a lot. So, where you have things going on with large bodies of water, in particular fast-moving bodies of water, we got to pay a lot of attention to that this semester at your park, okay? Cool. So, I don't know if you can see this with the shades up and stuff like this. Let me loop this one a little bit for us. This is a very particular kind of flat water. Can everybody see the color? Not close by. It's fairly clear here. But can you see the tint to the reflection of the mountains in the background in the middle ground of this short looping video? What color is this water? It's not sky blue, which is its normal default value. What color is that? This is not a hard question or a trick one.
Like a dark turquoise?
Yeah, it's kind of a blue-green color, turquoise. Very good. Okay. When you see that turquoise color, and we will see it at various deeper pools in Ozark Scenic Riverways, that is a very clear signal for dissolved minerals. Okay, so this is an interaction between the underlying bedrock resource and the water resource, and how the water is mobilizing minerals out of the crystalline matrix of the bedrock and into the water column. This is very characteristic of calcium, magnesium, other 2+ oxidation state ions of metals in the water column, and this is not easy to fix if it gets broken with water pollution or turbidity. Okay? This is indicative of a very specific kind of freshwater habitat upon which a lot of your other resources, vegetation and wildlife, aquatic wildlife like lake trout, stuff like that, they need to be able to access this and stay here and exist here without a whole bunch of people doing some specific recreation behaviors that can knock this wildly out of balance real fast. With even just a couple of recreationists, the higher elevation you go. So, for example, let's say you've been backpacking in Glacier for a week. That sounds like a pretty good trip. And you get up a little bit higher elevation, up into mountains like this, and you come across a subalpine, so just below tree line, beautiful freshwater lake like this. And it's summertime, and you're hot, and you're nasty, and you're sweaty, and you're walking along sort of the downslope edge of this, maybe a moraine, so a glacial sort of gravel bar is defining the bottom or downslope edge of this body of water, and you don't see an outflow stream. But this is a really cool lake, and it's a hot day, and you've been backpacking for a week, and you're nasty. You've got the Fremunda cheese going on. I mean, you're just disgusting. So it's like, all right, let me drop my pack, kick off my shoes, and go for a swim. A whole bunch of things happen, a whole bunch of changes happen, a whole bunch of impacts happen the moment you dive into that water, the moment you recreationists dive into that water, because our bodies are covered in what? Multiple answers to this question. What's on the surface of our bodies that's getting transferred into that water real fast? And some of these ponds and lakes, not very big.
Bug sprays and plastic.
Bug sprays, plastic fibers from your clothing, yeah.
Sunscreen.
Sunscreen, exactly.
Yeast and bacteria.
Yeast and bacteria, fecal coliform bacteria. It's hard to be perfectly sanitized in a backcountry environment, right? For the health of your skin, you don't want to be perfectly sanitized all over. You can get very sick that way. Okay? So, what's going on is a whole bunch of introduction of other things. Like a whole bunch of introduction of other things. This kind of process, but in ships instead of in human beings, is how we've been leapfrogging zebra mussels and silver carp, Asian carp, whatever you want to call them, up the Mississippi and into water bodies all over the Midwestern United States. And zebra mussels have been utterly destroying major ecosystem changes from this one sort of filter feeding species, clearing up water columns like this and removing nutrients and multiplying in the millions, sometimes per individual reproducing organism. I mean, just absolutely impossible to keep up with. So, when people dive into stuff like this, they're having a really good experience. You've done a great job as a backcountry ranger protecting the opportunity to experience an ice-cold swim in a beautiful subalpine moraine-entrained lake or pond. But after even just a couple of years of backpackers doing this, recreation ecologists in the 70s and 80s found that you can actually sterilize this pond. The chemicals in sunscreen are no joke. Stuff like avobenzone, oxybenzone, or octylmethoxycinnamate. They're these big, specifically engineered molecules that can take incipient ultraviolet energy, which is strong enough to photolyze your DNA, just break apart the polymer of the genes that define you, and the DNA specifically that defines you, and give you stuff like skin cancer, right? This chemical paint is strong enough to withstand that, for a period of hours at least. It works by breaking down instead of you breaking down. But transferring that stuff into one of these watersheds where the amphibians are absorbing this stuff straight through their skin, that's how some of them breathe, that's how some of them regulate their moisture content and so forth. Like, this is a big deal. And so, when we get to the management response or techniques or prevention section of water resources, sometimes the move is to shut down the trails, destroy and hide the campsites that people have been setting up for decades or centuries around these beautiful, absolutely worth the trip spots, because we cannot make an alpine or subalpine pond without an outwash stream safe against or resistant to the impacts of sunscreen. Like, these organisms, they can't keep up with industrial skin chemistry, okay? Yeah.
Speaking of like bluish green water, in the Shawnee there's like a bunch of like parts of like the creeks and stuff like that are a little bit deeper that have like really bluish green water.
Yep.
I was told that it was because that they like over nitrated the soil, and then there's some bacteria that grew and like now is like pretty dominant in the area.
Okay.
And that's why it's like bluish green. Do you have any more like information about that?
Yeah, so that's a parallel symptom, but a completely different cause. So what you're talking about is eutrophication. So the artificial introduction of really chemical fertilizers since World War II, where basically Seychelles, a bunch of Nazi scientists figured out how to take and use, American scientists too, take nitrogen, diatomic atmospheric nitrogen, which is a really hard molecule to crack. It's got a triple bond between those two ends in that 2N molecule. And so you break that apart and start hooking other stuff like carbon and hydrogens onto those freed up bonds, and you can turn that into essentially nitrate fertilizer. You take it from diatomic nitrogen to any NOx compound, NO2, NO3, NO4, and each of those with different functional groups hooked on there, different kinds of nitrogen fixing bacteria or legumes or just non-fixing root hairs and like the fungal symbiosis on root hairs and stuff like that, fungal mycorrhizae, all of that stuff becomes biologically available in any form other than diatomic nitrogen. So when you figure out how to do that at an industrial scale, we get what's called the green revolution out of that. We can feed billions, literally billions more human beings by generating industrial synthetic fertilizers out of nitrogen and out of mineral phosphorus. We basically mined a couple of small Pacific islands actually off the face of the planet. We took them below waterline. They don't exist anymore. And we're going to run out of mineral phosphorus deposits in 80 or 120 years, something like that, depending on current rates. Then we'll figure something else out or we'll all starve to death. Anyway, it's all very exciting. But all I had to say, you spray this nitrate fertilizer, this synthetically enriched nitrate fertilizer on farm fields and stuff like that, any or all of the extra either goes off into the atmosphere in the gas phase as extremely potent greenhouse gases that happen to be relatively short-lived, but like hundreds and hundreds of times more powerful than carbon dioxide at trapping heat, or it gets washed out in the water fraction through tile drainage, stuff like that, into the Mississippi, into smaller sub-drainages, the Big Muddy as it drains farm fields and stuff like that. And that causes not just the corn to grow bigger, but stuff like algae to grow. And in some cases, cyanobacteria, which is what sounds like your friends were talking about, with that blue-green color. Now, algae isn't necessarily just green. Sometimes it's red or brown or like bright blue or saturated green or just kind of gray looking. There are lots of different kinds of algae. But that's not a sort of a milky calcite turquoise color. It's more of a, like if you look closely enough, you can see, oh, that's green because that's a chunk of algae floating by, that kind of a thing.
A little bit off topic, but
yeah.
I remember reading about one of Earth's largest non-nuclear explosions was one of those German nitrogen fixing plants that are doing on industrial scale, pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
They messed something up and it went off, and it was the equivalent of thousands of megatons of TNT. Blew out windows hundreds of kilometers away.
Yeah, there's actually there have been a couple of different examples of that happening. So was it in Syria or Lebanon or
that ship.
Jordan? It was a dockside warehouse that had been, no,
I think it
was it a ship? No, Beirut. Yeah, it was in Beirut, Lebanon. So yeah, it was basically a ship or a warehouse that had been taking the, I don't know how many thousands of tons of nitrate fertilizer and storing it because the ship's operators had abandoned it, or the company had gone out of business while the ship was in the water or something. It was something like that. It was just stored in this warehouse, and it blew a big hole in the city of Lebanon. Nitrogenous compounds are just high energy compounds. They don't make low energy bonds, chemically speaking. So that's a thing, and it's never not going to be a thing. It's inherent to the the electron geometry of the nitrogen atom. So this is why we get truck bombs, right? We're not going to stop making synthetic nitrate fertilizers. We can't. People will starve. But it's cheap. It's really pretty easy to do. We're never going to run out of nitrogen. 70% of our atmosphere is it. And so you just pull it out of the air and turn it into whatever you need. And stuff like that. So improvised explosive devices aside, that eutrophication problem is generally not a problem at national parks because we tend to be preserving the mountains at the top of the watershed, and people are spraying either synthetic fertilizers or stuff like cow manure, which also can cause eutrophication, or like pig feces retention ponds for those big swine farms and stuff like that. Every once in a while, one of those will break and wash, 20 million gallons of poop into a nearby watershed and kill everything nearby. But that's generally not as much of a problem up watershed where national parks tend to be. Now, if you chose like a national seashore, you are definitionally down at the bottom of the watershed, and humanity is pretty good at, as has been said, shitting where we eat, and so everything is flowing down to you. So the bayou in Louisiana, for example, is dealing with the Minnesotan farmers' overuse of synthetic fertilizers, and as a result, that bayou is difficult to manage. We have the greater Mississippi dead zone there every late summer into autumn. This big section visible from space in hyperspectral imagery, spanning the coastline of a couple of states. And that's all just extra fertilizer that's been washed out from over-fertilizing. So, long answer to your question, but yeah, this is a natural chemical dissolution process. And so this is like low-key, very slightly, you couldn't taste it, salt ions in the water. Calcium, magnesium instead of sodium that we're used to in table salt, sodium chloride. That is something different. That's a biological generation and coloration of the water.
When we were there, there was no actual algae. Is there just is it algae that we just weren't able to see, or because it was more of a color more similar to that when we saw it. But is that something different, or is it the same thing, just a different algae species or something?
So the difference is the cloudiness. That's a really good question, and a very particular one. So in this case, those ions are dissolved in the water like sugar in Kool-Aid. So solutions with dissolved things in them are clear. You can see all the way through, always. It might be whatever color it is, based on whatever organic dye in the case of Kool-Aid, or whatever ions, mineral ions, cations in this case, calcium 2+, magnesium 2+, stuff like that, are present in the water column. And as you look through it, you can still see this water is perfectly clear. So when you go to Rocky Mountain National Park and you go up to Bear Lake, Dream Lake, Nymph Lake, Lake Hiaha, stuff like that, you can see in places stuff like this, although calcium concentration isn't near as high, and the water is crystal clear. It's deceptively clear in the sense of if you look down through it, it can be a lot deeper because of refraction. Refraction can be a lot deeper than it looks. If you've ever tried spearfishing, refraction makes it tricky. Okay, but for the case of eutrophication, where the fertilizer is causing a biological thing, biological organisms can't be dissolved in waters. They function like either microscopic or macroscopic particles in that water. So it's a suspension like the clay particles we were talking about, settling out of a jar or settling out of a glacially fed milk stream. Okay, so if it's cloudy and you can't see through, probably biological. If it's colored or tinted but you can absolutely see through, probably more of a solution and more likely to be natural. Okay, cool, good question. All right, let's continue on. So this is the physical, the chemical, the experiential aspects of water. Let's talk a little bit about biological aspects of water. So the water quality in terms of what's living in it. And for our purposes in recreation management, we mostly care about what are the pathogens in the water that are probably naturally there. Things like Giardia or various strains of Escherichia coli or Shigella or any of the other usual suspects that you'll see in the PowerPoint when you jump into that. We care about those. We care about people running afoul of those. And we care a lot about a few of those because they produce acute on-site effects or acute delayed effects. So for example, when I hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2004, one of my hiking buddies, a gal who went by the trail name of Moon Pie, got a pretty nasty case of giardiasis. So a lot of these organisms that get into your body as a function of drinking untreated water, or poor hygiene, so-called ass-to-mouth disease, where you get some E. coli on your hand and then reach into your friend's food bag, grab some food, leave a little bit of poop particle behind for them. They eat that with their food. They get sick because their gut flora isn't used to your gut flora, and we have a problem. In that way, it can be either acute, like E. coli symptoms showing up in like a day or two. So that would be like painful gas, bloody diarrhea, dehydration, poor nutrient uptake because you eat something and you poop it out like an hour later instead of digesting it for 36. That's one thing. That can lead to a lot of search and rescue. That is entirely preventable, right? We have lots of tools to treat water cheaply and highly effectively. Everything from UV light, from Steripens, to boiling the water in your cook pot, to putting chlorine oxidants in there. You can electrolyze salt apart to generate free chlorine atoms and just kill everything in your water using little battery powered systems like the Myox. You can dunk some bleach in there. You can put other chlorine-based oxidants other than chlorine dioxide in, like chloramines and stuff like that, with Aquamira, a phosphoric acid activated chlorine disinfectant. Just 2 little eyedroppers of that stuff. You can throw some iodine in there. That'll kill everything off. Like, we have means to solve this problem, but nobody hikes 2,200 miles without, making a mistake here or there, or somebody, as you're purifying your water, splashes their untreated water off across you and you don't realize it, or any of the million ways that we could vector these microorganisms inside of you. All right, so we're talking about viruses and DNA payloads or protein payloads like prions, such as that cause mad cow disease, stuff like that. Or chronic wasting disease in deer, and in apparently some hunters. We're talking about bacteria like E. coli, and we're talking about higher order organisms like E. coli, which is a protozoan. It's a little bit more active, a little bit more highly developed, better able to, I was going to say push your shit in a way that sounded kind of confrontational, but really what Giardia does is quite the opposite. It causes absolutely uncontrollable explosive diarrhea, which is funny in a classroom setting, but out in the field, it can be debilitating, like to the point of you can't hike yourself out because you're too weak and too dehydrated, and then you're in a really, really bad spot. So, in 2004, this happened to my friend Moon Pie, and she lost a bunch of weight real fast and had to hike out and get a treatment course of Cipro, which is what we were issuing to general infantry back in the day when we were worried about stuff like anthrax. Cipro is a broad spectrum antibiotic that kills everything in you that is not human cells. All of it. All of the healthy gut bacteria, all of the bad stuff, whatever worms you've picked up and you don't know about. I mean, just everything. Just unbelievable. And it's a rough ride. Like, while you repopulate your guts with the healthy bacteria that help you digest things or absorb those nutrients, you can be in a pretty awful spot. Some people have to be hospitalized during treatment because it's so bad. You gotta get like IV fluids and IV nutrients, and it's nuts. It's really, really, really nuts. So, all that to say, we've got the physical, chemical, biological with these different microorganisms, and these microorganisms can persist. We've also got the experiential aspects of our water resource to protect. All right, so the issue with E. coli is that E. coli can insist. That is, insist, not insist, like be demanding. It can wrap itself in basically a thin candy shell, like M&M's, so they melt in your guts, not in your hand. And they can stay in this dormant, encysted form for up to a decade. So, if some total jackwagon pinches a loaf in or just upstream of a stream or seep water source coming out of the side of the mountain where backpackers have been getting water there for years and years and years, or if a deer dies just out of sight upslope and its body is decaying and leaving things or leaching pathogens into that surface water supply, here's the thing. That unfortunate problem, somebody taking a dump near the stream or in the stream if they're whacked out on drugs or something, I don't know, that could happen up to a decade ago. And for that entire following decade, that water source, it looks fine, but it's not. You're picking up stuff right there. And so you have to have your people, generally speaking, and some of them people are highly resistant to this, but you have to have everybody treat all of their water for any kind of backcountry use. Now, not all parks have backcountry use, or at least extended backcountry use. At Arches National Park, for example, they really don't want you backpacking there. It would be an amazing place for backpacking, like world class. Just go skipping around among the arches for a week or two or whatever. But for a variety of management reasons and resource protection reasons, that's not a great idea there. There's not really long distance backpacking or any backcountry camping even for one overnight at national parks like Acadia National Park, with 4.5 million visitors a year, only on 44,000 acres. They got to combine and condense everybody or concentrate everybody into these developed campgrounds and just sort of kind of limit all the impacts to right there and leave the rest of the fragile northeastern open seaside terrain mostly undisturbed. So, some people really don't like the idea of being told to treat their water. Like, part of the experience for them is, I want to drink of the blood of the earth with my own two lips and not have some chemical company like McNett, which manufactures Aquamira, inserting itself and its tap water taste into my freshwater drinking experience. And, those people are gonna need some urgent care sooner or later. Okay? The other thing that we would be concerned with in terms of biological water contamination is chemical biological water contamination for things like cyanobacteria or certain kinds of algae, like you guys are all familiar with red tides in Florida and stuff like that? Okay, I believe that is a cyanobacteria that, as a waste product, a metabolic byproduct, basically their poop, they give off or emit what is, for higher order organisms, like in particular, most commonly dogs at beaches, it's a neurotoxin. So, people go to the beach or they go to some of these places with some eutrophication present, and there's a toxic algal bloom. They're called tabs. We had like genuinely dangerous toxic algal blooms going on in Campus Lake several years ago. Were you guys here when they like drained the lake completely? They had like bucket scoops and bulldozers out there in the dry lake bed, basically scraping up the top couple of feet of the sediment and dead organic material at the bottom, because it was all totally shot through with this neurotoxic stuff. And we trucked it off in I don't know how many hundreds of dump truck loads they spent, and the university paid some farmer a bunch of money to like dump this super toxic soil onto a field and just like be done with it. We can't really do that in national parks, right? So these toxic algal blooms, we have to issue drinking water advisories, and we saw some of those on summer camp this year out west. Some ranger had to print out an advisory warning: hey, do not drink from this water source, or that one. You have to push through and get to the fourth one beyond those three, because all three of these are testing positive for neurotoxins in the water. And the water looks fine. Okay? So that can be a thing. Another kind of biological risk, which is really a chemical contamination, can be from natural sources. So there are a whole bunch of watering holes out west where it's like dead looking desert all around, just open desert floor. And then there's like some geologic formation that allows an upwelling through, a capped water or aquifer or something like that. So water is coming up in this one place in the desert and kind of nowhere else around. And the rest of it's all, miles underground. Sometimes you gotta check those spots to make sure that things are growing in that water, right? There's never a single answer, because in some of these watering holes out west, in the arid Southwest, there's arsenic in the water. And it's really high levels of arsenic in the water. But arsenic doesn't get you right away. It's a slow burn kind of a thing.
I've heard that if it smells like garlic, it probably has arsenic in it.
I don't know about the garlic smell. I've not heard that before, but yeah, if you can smell mineral contamination in water, there's a ton of contamination. We don't have great noses, but in any case, it looks like beautiful, clear water with not a whole bunch of stuff swimming in it and skating across the top of it and stuff like that, like water striders or water beetles or anything, because nothing can live in that water for long. And so you got to educate folks on, hey, this is like your only water source around that you can see. You need to bring water with you, or cache water ahead in milk jugs in a shady spot, like people do in the desert along the Pacific Crest Trail for the desert sections of it, because there's just no safe water, and you cannot make certain kinds of water safer. For example, if you have people boiling their water to sterilize it from all the bugs in there, and they're at elevation, that water is going to boil at a much lower temperature because the air pressure is lower. So it takes less thermal energy to cause those bubbles and to liberate steam into the air. So at 14,000 feet, you can't really boil water long enough. It's only reaching like 130 degrees instead of 212. And you can't eat beef at 130 degrees. You can't eat chicken at 130 degrees. You certainly don't want to eat pork heated to 130 degrees. So you have to educate people in that way. They're boiling the water. They're doing the right thing. Some folks just don't have the benefit of the collegiate education that you do, of understanding that the partial pressure or the vapor pressure of steam is not a clear sign of temperature or sterilization by itself at anything over like 8,000-10,000 feet. If there is a neurotoxin in the water, or if there's arsenic in the water, if you boil water, that's driving off water and leaving the toxin behind. You're actually making it more poisonous. Okay? So that's bad. We use the term poisonous specifically here because poisons are things that harm you when you eat them. Venoms are proteins or enzymes that an animal will inject into you to cause a negative reaction, but typically you're not eating the venom unless you're on Jackass or CKY. Okay? So, we are not going to use those terms interchangeably. A poison is something that you eat or drink. And venom is something that is injected into you exogenously by something other than you. Okay.
Follow up on arsenic.
Yeah.
Two very conflicting results on Google. One says arsenic has no smell or taste, and the next result says arsine is a colorless, flammable, non-irritating gas with a mild garlic odor. It's formed when arsenic comes in contact with an acid. So, maybe.
Maybe. All right, so the person's not wrong that it can smell like garlic, but at most of the concentrations we're gonna see, like sublethal concentrations, but that are harmful, probably can't smell it.
Right.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. So the moral of the story on contamination is, it's just, you can't trust it. Like, treat all water like it's trying to kill you, either physically by sweeping you away. You have to instruct people very, very specifically if they are backpacking and they have to ford a stream or river. I was on a backpacking trip in the Cranberry Mountains, Cranberry Wilderness area of West Virginia, and a buddy of mine punched through ice over a creek and fell in up to his waist in like 0-degree temperatures. And, you know, that's a function of the water resource in that backpacking area. It ended up being okay. We were going cross country off trail and punched through the ice. Not a great moment, but it worked out okay. We were both pretty experienced guys. Water is a resource, and we need to help people understand you need to treat all of this water like it's trying to kill you. I have seen a body pulled out of the Colorado River and like lashed onto the back of a mule train that services Phantom Ranch. It was a little boy who didn't realize how swift the Colorado flows in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, got swept away. His grandmother actually died as well, trying to rescue him. They did not find her body. Okay, so water is powerful. Water is beautiful, and it's an understandably powerful draw for all of the recreation opportunities and like the aesthetic values and even the spiritual values that it represents to various different groups of recreationists. All right, we talked a little bit about some of the impacts. Now, let's talk a little bit about the management of those impacts. Water is a fantastic transmitter of sound. So we have fairly substantial bodies of marine ecoacoustic data of whales transmitting vocabulary in their songs across the entire Pacific Ocean, which is several thousand miles wide. The only reason that works with unamplified whale calls is that water transmits sounds really far. So, to prevent impacts to the water resource and to prevent the water resource being used to transmit impacts like noise, engine sounds, and so forth, we have to understand water is really good at everything that it tries to do. Reducing mountains to rubble, washing mountains clean of their ions and transporting those metals, in this case calcium and magnesium, away, transmitting sound, knocking people over and washing them downstream and drowning people, and so on and so forth. Okay? Cool. So, anything to do with water recreation management, we typically have to do as kind of an all or nothing thing. There's no half measures like, okay, let's reduce use on Crab Orchard by 5% to try and accomplish XYZ. Usually it's more of an all or nothing kind of a thing. So like when we're talking about those alpine moraine entrained ponds or subalpine ponds, it's like this lake is big enough and it has an outflow stream to wash out all of that DEET, which is an industrial plasticizer developed around the time of World War II that dissolves plastic. Think about how few chemicals you know that can dissolve plastic, and how we store things like concentrated nitric or sulfuric acid in plastic. Like even concentrated mineral acids can't attack plastic. DEET can. It turns it into like this soft goo. People are slathering that on themselves and on their DNA, which is a polymer like plastic. Anyway, like that lake is either well drained, it's well flushed of DEET and sunblock and salts and everything else, or it isn't. So it can handle people swimming in there in the backcountry, or it can't. And therefore, we have a trail and campsites near it, or we don't, right? Not a lot of half measures with water, okay? So the PowerPoints will go into more detail on that. So take a look at those once those become available. I'll try and post that up after today's class sesh. Another thing we need to talk about real quick with water and understanding the lag effect of things like somebody poops in the water column and it's your problem for the next 10 years. And fish are pooping in the water continuously, so yeah. We also need to consider the cryofraction. So water has ice and snow. We manage a glacier really pretty differently than a lake below it, because the dynamics, the ecosystem dynamics, the human use dynamics, all of that completely different. So when we look at the cryofraction, this is going to be glaciers, ice fields, crevasse fields, icebergs for very northern parks like Gates of the Arctic, around Kodiak Island, stuff like that. We want to treat ice fields, alpine zones, so everything where it's like white at the top of the mountain, that's all cryo. We're going to treat those ecologically like deserts, because deserts and cryozones at opposite ends of the elevation profile, typically, you do have some high elevation deserts, but usually they're fairly low elevation, dry and hot. Neither cryofields nor deserts have flowing water. And flowing water is what you have to have for plants to survive, at least part of the year. So the subalpine to alpine transition zone, you have some flowing water, at least during the relatively hot part of the summer, where it might get up to 40 degrees, for a couple of weeks. And that's enough for a couple of small plants, maybe lichen, that symbiosis of fungi, cyanobacteria, bacteria, algae, etc., just sort of grows on rock faces. It just needs to be rained on once in a while, okay? You can't really do anything with ice, but a little bit of rain is enough for that stuff to hang on and digest that stone very slowly into soil antecedents. So we want to make sure that we get a sense of how difficult and fragile really the cryozone is. In the same way that human feces will not break down in a desert environment because there's no soil microbial activity to break it down. Like something's got to be doing the breaking down, it doesn't just happen. We're dealing with human feces in much the same way as we are in a desert. So where there's no water, there's no soil biological activity, there's no detritivorous or detritivore breakdown of stuff. Okay, there's no cycling of those nutrients, so you get eventually what are called coprolites. Coprolites are literally fossilized feces. Copro is fancy Latin for poop. Light denotes mineral. So you've heard of cryolite and all sorts of different minerals, and in light. Okay, so what's going on in the desert is this stuff is around for so long, it gets buried in sand and buried and buried and buried, that organic material gets replaced with mineral material, and it's an actual fossil of feces. In a cryo environment, it's not a coprolite proper, it's just frozen poop for thousands of years. So, up until recently, when Leave No Trace kind of became a thing, the outdoors person or outdoor enthusiast or alpinist, person who's going to high places, the practice was poop in a bag, drop it down a crack in the ice, and it's humanity's problem 10,000 years from now when this part of the glacier, the top end of the glacier, at the crevasse field, gets down to the bottom end, and the ice will have ground up that bag of poop and whatever. We've been dead for 10,000 years, nobody cares. Okay? That's not a very responsible use of what's going on, and as it turns out, with climate change and overall climate warming, a lot of those basically hiker or backpacker or mountain climber equivalents of the old trucker bomb, you know, where you pee in a gallon milk jug and throw it out the window on the highway. Like you've never done that. I'm kidding. You've probably never done that before. Please don't do that. But those things don't break down. They don't go away. And now with a lot of glaciers getting sort of undermined by their own meltwater, which lubricates and speeds and warms up the process of the glacier melting, it's a self-reinforcing loop. It's washing a bunch of that stuff out now. So old oxygen bottles, old dead climbers, old lost ice axes, crampons, the spikes that you strap onto your boots are called crampons, old bags of poop, old food wrappers like old Cliff Bars and stuff like that, back when Cliff Bars were first a thing. That stuff's all starting to wash out now in some places. And it is a big mess of a problem because it's many, many years of trash getting washed out into, or out of the cryo zone into the super fragile alpine zone we've been talking about this whole time, okay? Or the subalpine zone, like we saw in that looping image before. So, we want to understand that water in its frozen or in its liquid phase, or state, either one of those is tremendously powerful. There's nothing resisting, there's no way to resist a glacier. It's just kicking the can down the road for litter. For a long time we thought. Turns out it's not as long as we thought, nearly. Okay? So, wave action, specifically wake action. We're transitioning back to the flowing portion here, is another kind of recreation impact, specifically because we're burning the embodied chemical energy of fossil fuels in outboard and inboard motors and transferring that into forward motion, which becomes sideways motion energy, wave energy, as the wake, the rooster tail, the fantail spreads out and hits the shore. So in a lot of artificially created impoundments, all the dams and embankments across Illinois, there are thousands of them. People started learning in the 40s and 50s with the first motorboats, first recreational motorboats, that, gosh, a little bit of wave energy silts in, shallows up, heats up, makes more turbid, kills off everything in this nice lake that we worked so hard to blade out by basically capping off a stream in a little valley here in southern Illinois, like a smaller version of Crab Orchard. So, glaciers, irresistible. Wave energy, also irresistible, just on a smaller scale, but much faster time scale than a glacier, okay? So, where you have any kind of watercraft, especially powered watercraft use, you may need to, for the basic structure and function and ongoing use of that body of water, and very much in proportion to the number of horsepower of your peak users, like the most powerful boat on that lake is kind of setting the no pun intended, high water mark for how much work you need to do to armor up those very soft, saturated, fragile, and exposed shore soils. That wave action is gonna just nibble away with every pass of every boat and every water skier and everybody else. It's gonna pull some of those soil fragments, soil particles into the water. They're gonna settle fast or slow, and then the lake's a little bit more filled in. Again, it gets filled in, it gets shallow, it gets turbid. Because it is more shallow and more incipient energy is hitting all the way to the bottom of the lake, it's now hydrologically a pond, not a lake any longer. Ponds are defined by limnologists, people who study lakes, as a pond is where sunlight hits the bottom. A lake is where sunlight doesn't get all the way down. Is one way to define the difference between the two. Okay? So, wave action, wake action in particular, is a huge problem. And so our management response there can be a little bit more nuanced. If we cannot have people leaving poop on a glacier, pack it in, pack it out, kind of a response there, we can have people not throwing huge amounts of wake energy in certain spots, because not all areas of shore are going to be super vulnerable. Anything that's like a steep walled bank, very vulnerable. Anything that's a very, very shallow and covered in shoreline grasses or reeds or cane brakes, something like that, run boats through that area all day, have really, really high horsepower engines transferring absolutely crazy amounts of chemical energy into the kinetic energy of these waves and wavelets. Okay? So, you can use vegetation to allow for a much more exciting, much more high horsepower, much more energetically expressive kind of forest and water recreation, surface water recreation, than otherwise. Okay? If you can't do a whole bunch of vegetation, and you need a lot of vegetation to do it, a lot of shallow water rooted vegetation to counteract the effect of like a 20-foot cigar boat with like triple inboard engines or something. We go right beyond the capacity of shoreline vegetation to handle that impact. Has anybody ever seen like a strip along the edge of a lake, maybe a crab orchard, covered in rock? Okay, anybody know what the term for that is? What that stuff's called? Schoonover will tell you about this. It's called riprap. You just get a bunch of real cheap limestone. Usually the pieces are fairly big because you don't want like a storm moving a whole bunch of pebbles down into the water, and then you got to fix it and do it again next season right after that storm. So these are pretty big cobbles or larger sized chunks. At the ocean side, these can be the size of a car or larger, like those old tank traps, dragon's teeth, whatever they were called. You armor up the shoreline physically with riprap. Now, that solves the wake energy problem and the waves eating soil and taking it and silting in and filling in your lake pond. But you're altering the water chemistry, because usually riprap is made out of very soft, very cheap limestone. And limestone is full of calcium and magnesium ions, and it turns the water more alkaline. So if you have sensitive species that are very dependent on a specific narrow pH range, acidity versus alkalinity or acid versus basic, you add a whole bunch of limestone and rock powder off the limestone into a section of that habitat, and now we can't have those shore rooted vegetation mats for reproductive habitat. We can't have the right pH range. As it turns out, limestone rock, that stuff, riprap, crushed gravel, what color is it? It's really light or dark?
Light gray.
Really light gray. So it can change the temperature profile of all the water nearby too, because dark green vegetation traps and releases or re-radiates infrared energy as heat very differently than very sort of medium gray or light gray, almost white in spots. 150 meter long sections of riprap that you're putting in with a bucket scoop and stuff like that. So you can armor stuff up with boats or against boats and wake energy, but you're going to pay a trade-off to do it. You don't get anything for free, right, in management. So maybe that's an okay trade-off. You talk with your limnologist, your freshwater biologist on site, and they say, yeah, we don't have any endangered salamanders or anything that are going to get totally obliterated by putting in some riprap. Let's get 40 dump truck loads to armor up this section of our causeway or what have you, and we should be pretty well good to go. Like, that limestone riprap doesn't really go away. It's going to be there for your lifetime, right? And longer. But the park biologist may come back and say, no, we really can't do that because we have such and such species that is obligate to this temperature range or that pH range or that shoreline habitat to reproduce in, because let's be honest, it wants to reproduce in like full view of everything on a whole bunch of synthetically placed riprap. It's not very romantic. So they may tie your hands and say, nope, we can't make this particular trade-off. This is a solution, but it's not a valid one for this particular circumstance. So when we're thinking about your park, wherever that is, do you have standing water? Do you have energetic flowing water that has standing hydraulics and waterfalls or whitewater rapid features? Do you have anything in a cryo compartment that we need to treat like extremely fragile desert? Extremely fragile desert biological, but extremely resistant to mechanical impacts, because if there's 20 or 30 or 40 feet of snowpack where you have alpinists going across the top of it, they're not hurting anything. Right? That snow, that trail that you're post-holing through, that's just going to get snowed over again next time there's any kind of snow event. Or it's going to melt away and then get snowed in the next season. So it's complex, okay? Any questions about water as a resource, the cryofraction of water as a solid, dry resource, characteristic impacts, physical, chemical, biological, aesthetic, and experiential, or some of the management trade-offs or strategies we can do to try and mitigate any of those impacts. Any questions so far? All right, cool. I apologize for going almost our whole class session today. This is hopefully a pretty good preview of PowerPoints and stuff like that, but we want to see some good examples of this stuff where we can. So that looks like a pretty fun experience for a very specific high skill kind of person, yeah? Let's loop this and sort of end up with the experiential aspect of this. Okay, let me turn up the volume here for a couple of these cycles so you can hear what's going on. Sick edit, right? All that bass drop. Man, Skrillex would be proud. Okay, so why do we put electronic, EDM, as the suitable backdrop music for this? Because this is exciting, and there's danger, and like Austin Powers, a lot of people think danger's their middle name. So, this is pretty cool. This is pro-level recreation going on here. We don't want most people even trying this from the perspective of park management, right? Like most of us, let's be honest, we're a bunch of weekend warriors. Maybe we go out for a hike every once in a while, but, we're going to be in over our head pretty fast in a situation like this. Specialized gear, specialized skill, lots of experience, and therefore, our management approach on making sure that only qualified people are able to access this, so that we're not putting your co-workers, your staff, your teammates, you in danger as well for swift water rescue. Like if this person gets in trouble, they have some seconds, maybe 15 to 30 seconds to get the situation, here's the technical term, unfucked. And for everybody who tries to respond to that emergency, all of them are now in danger as well, okay? It becomes, or it can become, in a poorly planned out situation, a real hazard for everybody involved. Everybody involved, okay? So, our management tactic here is to not increase supply of the resource. We've got enough white water here, clearly. We don't need to increase the supply in real or effective terms. Increasing the supply in real terms would be like dumping some extra boulders in this water course to create some additional hydraulics. Where we have this one here in frame, we might have 2 or 3 within 50 meters of here.
Some cities have even like made whitewater.
Oh, whitewater parks are awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cheap, right? You just have a section of the river diverted, dump in some field stones, string some steel cables across with those little bars they have to swim through or paddle through, and you just, the point of recreation management isn't to print money, but that's one that can, okay? Anyway, there's a lot of expense in the design phase to make sure it's safe and sustainable, but once it's going, it's just kind of going. So the answer here isn't necessarily to increase supply on real or effective terms. It's not really either to harden this resource against impacts. This kayaker is not hurting anything, right? This kayaker can't hurt this system. You could throw 1,000 kayakers through here and the river wouldn't even know, right? Not a big deal. So we don't need to harden it. We don't need to make it more resilient against impacts. Here our solution is to modify visitor use. And specifically under modifying visitor use, we can do either direct modification, say you can do this, you can't do this, you can do it here, you can't do it there, you can do it now, you can't do it then. Right? Modifying use directly. Our answer here is not to have like an educational or instructional video in the visitor center, because I don't care how good your VHS editing skills are, you're not going to make this safe for somebody who's not fully prepared already coming in your front gate the first time. Okay, so we can modify use by restricting this use, maybe even limiting use to very specific people who apply for the permit to do it, a special use permit, in recognizance of the sense of this is too dangerous, this is lethally dangerous for most people. So if you want to do this, you can. This is a free country and this is your national park. But you need to demonstrate, you need to show the Swiftwater Ranger in charge of managing this, the gear that you're going to use, like the specific life jacket and helmet. This person is wearing a helmet because getting slammed against these rocks by the equivalent of like several hundred fire hoses blasting all at once side by side is this flow right here. Those rocks can put a pretty good hurt on you pretty quick, okay? And your brain case is about the consistency of a watermelon or cantaloupe in terms of resisting impacts.
You're also not going to float in white water.
Right. That water is moving way too turbulently. So there's laminar flow, which is the smooth, glassy flow of like Dyson water fountains and the expensive water shows in like Las Vegas and stuff like that. That's laminar flow. This is turbulent flow. This is not laminar. And turbulent flow doesn't really care much about buoyancy because the volume occupied by that kayak and the person in it is something like 1,500 to 3,000 pounds Right? So if that water is moving, if just that much, one kayaker worth of water is moving and moving pretty fast, right, it can overcome that buoyancy force of the air inside the kayak's hull instantly, right? Get shoved down 10, 12 feet and then pinned against a rock. And with a cyclic or tumbling flow right there, you just get hit against the rock 10, 12 feet underwater until the end of that flow event. Okay? Might be days or weeks. So, the answer here is limit use to very specific people with a permit or special use permit system that ensures and verifies that they have the correct gear, they have the correct knowledge and skill, and they are willing to commit resources to it. There's a cost, like a monetary cost to this. Later on in the semester, we'll talk about the problems of charging people for access to stuff, but sometimes it's a useful tool because not everybody can afford things the same way. That make sense? How much is a whitetail doe tag in Illinois for any of you guys and gals who are hunters? Anybody know? Got a tag lately? Not very expensive. No? For pest species, they're free. In some states, they'll pay you to go hunting for certain varmint species, right? For more highly sought after things, those tags can be hundreds of dollars for a chance to get it, not even the guarantee. So in this case, you don't want a lot of people beating down your gate to try this out necessarily. You want to make sure that everybody who is really into it. So that can be used as justification to say, all right, this permit's just to be able to do this is a couple $100. And we're going to price that by how much it's going to cost to rescue somebody in that case. It's $250,000 to spin the rotors on a rescue aircraft to pull stranded alpinists off Denali National Park. $250,000. So you got to pay a couple of bucks to try and summit Denali. So we'll end with this. For risky kinds of activities in high energy, high velocity water or high elevation cryo situations, you can impose a fee or permit cost with a real and rational basis and a fair basis that is in recognition of the fact that you shouldn't have to be a millionaire to go enjoy the national park that you're managing. So if it costs, let's say, $50,000 to mount a rescue with EMS, Swiftwater certified folks and the gear, $50,000, and we have one out of how many people do you think is going to require rescue when attempting something like this? Just make up a number. What we're going to
Maybe 1 in
do.
10.
Say again?
Maybe like 1 in 10 or something like that.
Okay. So, if we have a $50,000 cost of rescue, divide that by our best, well-informed, National Park Service has an army of statisticians that curate stuff like this to figure out, so we don't just make up a number, but let's say 1 in 10. We're going to have to spend $50,000, not every time, but every 10th time, on average, over 100 years, or 100 recreation seasons. Then we're going to end up spending $5,000 per. Thanks for using a nice round number like 10. That's a bro right there. So that's how you can set things like fee costs. Say, this is how much it costs to rescue you. This is how often that happens. And so you and everybody else, we're not making any money on this, right? Because we're spending that $5,000 per person, but we're really spending it $50,000 on every 10th person, okay? So stuff like this, we've got a lot of years of kayaking data. We know how often this is happening at each particular place. The detailed statistics are there. Okay, so we have now entered the exciting world of statistical risk analysis. Try to contain your excitement, I understand. If you're feeling kind of bored, just think about copper lights and laugh, and everything will be fine. All right, that's it for today. See you next week. I'll post this recording stuff online. Take a look at the water resources stuff once that's available. And again, take a look at your national park and what the water resources at it might be. What's in the liquid fraction, what's in the ice fraction, what's flowing, what is still, what is above ground, what is underground. Thanks. See you next time.